Welcome to Standing for Truth Ministries. I hope you like this next edition of Noah's Flood. When the critics say there is no evidence for a global flood,
you sure about that?
If Noah's flood was true, what would we expect to find? Well, if everything was running for its life from rising floodwaters, we would expect to constantly find fossil tracks in rock layers below where the organism that left them was found. We would also expect to find whales far from the ocean, and even on mountains. We would expect to find not just river aquatic life fossilized readily, but deep sea creatures buried in sediments as well. We would expect to find fossil graveyards with a mix of aquatic life and land life. We would expect to find evidence of rapid plate movement and subduction. We would expect to find slabs of Earth's crust near Earth's core still cold. We would expect to find radiometric dates that perfectly land on the biblical young Earth creation timeline for seafloor spreading. We would also expect to find fission tracks near the surface of rocks. We would expect to find the majority of rocks have different radioactive elements at different gradients within them. We would expect to find the majority of radioactive elements on the crust of the Earth and not deep inside of it, with them being highly unevenly distributed. We would also expect to find rapid formation of granites worldwide. We would also expect to find the oldest and largest desert dates right back to the global flood as well. We would expect to find few lightning strike fossils known as fulgurites. We would also expect to find fossils near the coastlines as the water runoff from the continents dumps back into the ocean, bringing the fossils with them. We would also expect to find a total lack of fossils in the geologic column because not a lot of time has passed, and since millions of years have never existed, we would expect fossil gaps and missing fossils everywhere we look. We would also expect to find very few total fossil impact meteor craters on Earth as well. We would expect to find pooled water under hills and mountains. We would expect to find all of the continents getting flooded at the same time worldwide. We would expect to find the Earth before the flood was created full of oxygen and water and Eden from the very beginning, just like the Bible says. We would also expect to find the fossil record does not show only slow, gradual change over time, but complete contradictions of that throughout the entire geologic column. We would expect to find fossilized, soft-bodied organisms completely opposite of what Darwin said would be possible. We would expect to find the same rock layers going across continents. We would expect to find mountains that formed soft and bent before the rock solidified. We would expect to find the ocean's acidity and salt have not yet reached equilibrium. We would expect to find a single ice age in ice core layers. We would expect to find that river deltas have very little sediments built up. We would expect to find dinosaur tracks going through supposed millions of years of geologic time. We would expect to find carbon-14 in dinosaur fossils, and we would expect to find some of the original bone not yet completely fossilized either, including soft tissue, blood cells, and even dinosaur DNA itself. We would expect to find simulations confirming the continents moved into their positions over just a single year. We would expect to find tests done on the shape and design of Noah's Ark to be extremely seaworthy and withstand massive flooding waves in the open sea from actual experiments. We would also expect to see the Ark be able to carry a massive payload of animals if required.
In 2014, a group of master students at Leicester University decided to settle the question. They used the biblical measurements to calculate the size of the ark. Then they used the density of the water to figure buoyancy, and from there determined how much weight the ship could endure before sinking. Their conclusion? Noah could have put 70,000 animals on board and the ship would have floated.
And what do you know? It floats!
We would expect to find that when only a single pair of animals are left isolated on an island, for example, that they can recover and repopulate easily without any inbreeding problem. The exact opposite of what evolution expected to find. We would also expect to find the oldest living organisms only go back to the date of Noah's flood. We would also expect to find low genetic diversity in all life. And we would expect to find mutation rates in all life to be fast that take us right back, again, the global flood event. We would also expect to find all life is genetically about the same age. And we would expect to find population growth matches up perfectly to this date of Noah's flood. We would also expect to find genetic boundaries, something that no evolutionist would have ever expected to find or even thought possible. It was also something that perplexed Darwin when he looked at the fossil record. We would expect to find rapid speciation rates and hybridization rates. We would also expect to find hundreds of living fossils throughout the world. We would also expect that the oldest unbroken chain of genealogies taking us right back to Noah himself. We would also expect that the oldest civilizations, the oldest forms of irrigation, the oldest documented mathematics, medicine, music, brewing of alcohol, astronomy, and even calendars all go back in time to Noah's flood. We would also expect new languages to just arise out of nowhere at the same time without any convergence going back to a single root language that slowly evolved over time to the rest of the languages we have today. We might also expect to find, at least somewhere on Earth, evidence of man and dinosaur together in the same geologic rock layer, in one of the many bone beds of mass dinosaur fossil graveyards on Earth. We would also expect to find legends all around the world talking about this global flood event. And guess what? We have found all of these things and much more. Many of these were prior predictions based on Noah's flood being true. And this is just a small sample of evidence. So when the critics say there is no evidence for a global flood,
you sure about that?
They have either never studied the subject at all, or they simply just do not want to believe it. Why are people today so blind when it comes to the global flood? This all comes from a lawyer named Charles Lyell back in the 1830s who hated the Bible and had an agenda. It was, as he wrote in his private diary, which was later found after his death, it said that he wanted to free the sciences of Moses. He wanted people to ignore catastrophism described in the Bible. So he narrowed everyone's view of the past into what is known as uniformitarianism. That is, we should only look at the past based on what we see occurring today. A foolish anti-science view, but it worked nonetheless. For evidence for this made-up belief, he went to Niagara Falls and asked a local geologist how fast he thought these falls were receding. The man told him about 3 feet a year. This was way too fast for Lyell though. So after zero investigation for himself on the actual erosion rate, he returned home and he said that the falls are eroding at only 1 foot per year. This made-up exaggeration lie was published and sold to the public as a fact. Who bought it and fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. And this lie now pushed the age of the earth away from the creationist timeline and got rid of the pesky Noah's flood that he hated so much. And we know he was lying, not just because we found his diary, but because later, when they finally did a real scientific investigation of the fall's actual recession rate, they found out it was actually eroding at 5 feet a year. His lie was exposed, but by then the damage was already done. Uniformitarianism and deep evolutionary time had now taken root and spread throughout the public education system. The very system evolutionists are defending are the very ones that lied to them. Let that sink in. Lyell was influenced by the philosophical work of Lamarck from a book called Zoological Philosophy. In it, we read that if pushed as far as it must go, if worthy of anything, would prove that man may have come from the orangutan. Lyell also had a huge influence on Darwin. For example, Darwin only brought a few books on his voyage with him to the Galapagos Islands, and one of them was Lyell's Book of Lies. full of nothing but made-up myths of the past that he invented and pushed as actual science that Darwin took and expounded upon. Let that sink in as well. Darwin had already known of the work by British physician Francis Graham, who wrote Mongol in Our Midst, a study of man and his three faces, who described how three major races of groups of people, blacks, Asians, and Caucasians, were actually descended from the three different kinds of primates, the chimp, gorilla, and orangutan, and not the three sons of Noah. Darwin took these words and considered Noah's flood to not be true, and that evolution must be true history. So rather than the past is key to the present, he now followed Lyell's new anti-science dogma that only the present is key to the past. So when critics today say there is no evidence for a flood, all they are doing is repeating what they were told to believe in school, which all came from a lie, long ago from one man's agenda. So the next time someone says, "No geologist agrees with you," tell them, "Good, who cares?" All they're doing is trying to force a square peg through a round hole anyway. We've all learned the same thing in school, and we were all programmed to look through the same narrow blinders about our past. Real science is about questioning and removing old failed ideas like uniformitarianism that Lyell pushed so hard to make everyone believe. When someone who only knows one side of a subject tells me that I'm wrong, even though I used to believe as they did but have now looked at both sides, I know they're either ignorant, biased, anti-science, or like Charles Lyell himself, and have an agenda and an emotional attitude over the subject, and none of these are good. So one, who cares what the majority believes, especially when we know for a fact it's wrong and all based on an old lie and agenda from the past that was pushed hard on the public to make everyone view the past through a single narrow view of history, ignoring any data that contradicts it. And again, who cares about majority opinion? That's basically telling me that you have the least scientific mindset on earth. You're letting others do the thinking for you and tell you what to believe, rather than you thinking for yourself. The same people who learn the exact same thing in school as you, all based on the same circular, repeated lie decade after decade with no alternative. That's not science, that's a mockery of science. So any critic who says things like Noah's flood isn't true because yada 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 are basically just saying, I don't understand how this happened, so therefore it can't be true, and it contradicts what I was told to believe in school and what they presented as evidence, so I'm not going to believe anything else. They still have the same agenda and no one even notices or thinks to question it, because we're a species that has amnesia about the past. So think for yourself, and if you can remove the blinders and the emotion from the subject, you will see the evidence for Noah's flood everywhere you look, even in the science journals. They just have different names and different dates that are given. Are you an atheist? Does creationist content trigger you too much to even investigate the subject? Don't worry, there's a secular book about a global flood written by an atheist called Earth in Upheaval. You can thank me later. And after you're done with that book, come back to Standing for Truth and watch some of our videos where we cover much more evidence in extreme detail. Until next time.